All right. It's always a pleasure to have David Sirota, veteran reporter, former Bernie speechwriter, and of course, the founder of the absolutely irreplaceable The Lever here on Bad Faith Podcast. But it's particularly, a pleasure to have him in the context of the continuingly unfolding disaster in East Palestine, because no one has been doing as comprehensive, as critical, as useful coverage of that disaster as you and your team have been doing over at The Lever, David. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. And thanks for saying that.
It's absolutely true. That first article that you put out shortly after the crash that was so comprehensive has been a touchstone for me personally in the discussions I've been having over at the Hill and other places. And I truly don't know what I would do without it, especially because we've seen an emerging counter narrative that seems to be working overtime to absolve Norfolk Southern, the rail company at issue here, and frankly, politicians in both major corporate parties of any responsibility for what transpired in East Palestine. And chief among those is this fact check that came out by Glenn Kessler last week on the Washington Post, titled, "So Far, Trump's Rollback of Regulations Can't Be Blamed for Ohio Train Wreck." Now, what's funny, I saw some people, conservatives, mad about this because of the "so far," which, to be fair, I mean, I think some people are waiting to get a conclusive report from the National NSTB about what actually concretely was the cause of this crash. But just to take a step back, David, what do you say to folks that say the regulatory story here is a non-issue?
Well, there's a bunch of regulatory stories that are at issue. First and foremost, what I find funny and also maddening is this narrow statement that Donald Trump repealing the ECP brake rule, which is a brake rule about electronic brakes, a mandate for electronic brakes, that this wouldn't have affected the specific Ohio train derailment. And then that statement being said without a follow-up as to why. Well, why wouldn't Donald Trump's repeal have had anything to do with the Ohio derailment? The answer to it is because before Donald Trump repealed the ECP brake rule, the Obama administration narrowed all of the rules governing hazmat trains, narrowed those rules to the point of exempting the Ohio train from all of those rules. This is a part of the story that we at The Lever managed to report out originally, and we managed to get it into our big New York Times op-ed about this, but that the media subsequently has essentially memory hold. It's gone. You cannot find this. And this is, to me, this is just as big a problem as anything that Trump had done. So back in 2014, the Obama administration was considering new rules governing trains carrying hazardous materials. There had been a number of derailments and disasters dealing a lot with oil trains. But there was also a disaster in New Jersey, a derailment of actually a train with the same chemicals that were at issue in East Palestine, vinyl chloride. And the Obama administration put forward new rules to tighten the regulations on these trains. And the NTSB at the time went to the Obama administration and said, you need to make sure that these rules cover trains carrying all sorts of chemicals, not just oil and ethanol, but also trains carrying what's known as Class 2 flammable materials, combustible materials. And the Obama administration ended up siding with the chemical industry lobby, which said, no. You should not have these rules cover trains that are carrying those compounds. It should basically essentially be limited to trains carrying many, many cars worth specifically of oil, but not other chemicals. point being here is that once that definition of what's known as a high hazard flammable train was narrowed as such, that the rules of the regulations in those rules did not apply to many trains. Rules such as the better braking system, rules such as you have to disclose to local authorities what are on those trains so that first responders know what they're responding to. Rules such as stronger tanks on trains, stronger tanks carrying the materials. So the point is that Donald Trump's subsequent repeal of the braking part of those rules was bad, because that was still an important piece of the rule in the sense of trying to get the industry to embrace those brakes and use them all throughout the nation's rail system. But it is sort of technically true that those braking rules would not have applied to the Ohio train. That's true, but it's true because the Obama administration sided with chemical industry lobbyists to narrow all of the rules to exempt that train.
Right. And that's why it is so important not to try to do this kind of partisan hackery that's emerged, I think, on both Fox News, which has very much been trying to push this as a, Biden neglect, Buttigieg neglect story, which it is, or on MSNBC, where it's a Republican hypocrisy story, which it is. If you don't tell that full story of the compounding negligence of both Republican and Democratic administrations, you can be technically fact-checked on some of this in a way that does not inure to the benefit of the people of East Palestine or any of these other communities through which railways drive, where people are at high risk for exactly these kinds of reasons. So I'm very interested about what happened in the Obama administration. It's interesting to me that the compromise position seems to have been, okay, we will have these hazardous designations for some trains and the ones carrying oil, but not for the hazardous, the toxic chemicals. What do you attribute that? Is it just that the oil lobby was less powerful than the chemical lobby? Were there other kind of pressures happening at the time where Obama's administration would be more pressured to look like they're coming down hard on the oil versus big chemical? What's the deal there?
I think it speaks to the power of the chemical industry, frankly, over democratic politics. It has more power over democratic politics than the oil lobby. Look, the oil lobby is powerful, obviously. It has disproportionately less power over Democratic politicians than it does over Republican politicians. Also, there was a lot of reporting at the time about the increased use of trains to carry oil, and there had been more oil train problems. So oil was certainly at the center of the conversation back then about hazardous trains. But I also think, again, the American Chemistry Council, as an example, is very, very powerful with both parties. It's perceived certainly among Democratic politicians as less controversial a lobby than the fossil fuel industry. So they were able to get their way. And of course, they made the argument that the rail industry makes. If you regulate all these chemicals, it'll create supply chain, it'll slow down the supply chain, it'll create too many costs, et cetera, et cetera. But there were local communities that were writing in to the Obama administration regulators saying, hey, all of the hazardous chemicals are hazardous chemicals. They all need to, if they're traveling through our communities, they need to be regulated as such. And I think the Obama administration kind of had a technocratic cost-benefit analysis view of this and took the cost-benefit analysis view of the chemical industry and said, look, we'll have some rules, but we're not. But this is the key part. To ignore the NTSB, to me, that is really insane, right? That's the Obama administration's NTSB. We have this in the documents. Going to the regulators saying these rules should be, the definition of who these rules apply to should be expansive and broad. And the administration sided against its own agencies, safety officials. That to me is a huge deal. Now, I want to be clear about one other point here. There is an argument that, none of the braking rules, even if the rules had applied to the Ohio train, would have prevented this disaster. I think, one, we don't fully know that yet. Two, we have quoted one former federal regulator saying, look, these brakes oftentimes can mitigate, make less bad a disaster that happens because of the way they work, how they slow down the cars across a giant mile-long train and the like. But also, as we reported, the Department of Transportation has not regulated and required sensors, as an example, on the heat sensors. So if you take the initial reporting that we see from East Palestine about how there was a heated bearing, there was signs of flame miles before the derailment, the federal government has not created mandates to put sensors on the rails to better and more quickly alert train crews to the problem at hand. That there aren't regulations for that. There can be regulations for that. Additionally, the Trump administration did not put in place a mandate for more people to be on these trains. This is the two-person crew issue. I mean, think about how insane it is that we're living in a world now where it's considered a radical, revolutionary, controversial proposal to say there should be at least two people on trains that are nearly 2 miles long. Right? I mean, that's where we are. It's unbelievable. Like that's considered like a great reform. And certainly it's a obviously necessary reform, but we're two people on a train that's nearly 2 miles long. Like this is considered like the sort of the most regulatory edge of the debate. Two people on a like how do we expect these things not to happen when you have only one or two people on these trains?
Well, here's what Glenn Kessler said about the two-person crew requirement. Fact checked. Relevance to the derailment? None. That he says the 149 car train that derailed had 2 crew members plus a trainee on board. He says after another crash, which had only 1 crew member on the train, the Obama administration in 2016 proposed a rule to require 2-person crews on all trains. The Trump administration withdrew the proposal in 2019, saying no direct conclusions could be drawn about train crew staffing safety impact on this magnetic or other this train accident or any other accidents. The Biden administration has said it will seek to revive the rule. So his fact check is to say 1 person versus 2 people would not have made a big difference, even though we're obviously talking in the context of being just a few months out from a huge labor battle about having more than just the 2-person requirement now on these trains. So he basically does what he does in a lot of this is kind of a sophistry to completely dodge the issue of whether more staffing than the 2-member crew plus trainee that were on this particular train might have enabled them to do more safety checks or be more responsive when the emergency emerged.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I think, look, it strains credulity to say that not having more people doing inspections, watching the train as it moves, that not having more people would potentially improve safety. It's just ridiculous. And here's the thing, that the rail industry has been reducing staff at a huge level over the last 10 years, which clearly reduces inspections and the like, which at the same time that it is spending billions and billions of dollars on stock buybacks. So it's not like the companies don't have the money to do this. It's that they're choosing not to do this inside of a regulatory system that allows them to make those choices. And this is where there's this debate, sort of a debate of, well, who's at fault? Is it the train company? Is it Norfolk Southern? Or is it the government regulators? My answer to that is yes, both, right? Mm-hmm. Yes, and, right? Like, I don't expect Norfolk Southern to do anything other than make decisions that enrich itself, enrich its shareholders, enrich its executives. They will make amoral decisions, not immoral, just amoral, no morality at all, decisions that enrich themselves within the context, up and until the rules say they can't make those decisions. They will make those decisions. They will maximize profits within what they are allowed to do. So yes, Norfolk Southern making decisions to spend more on buybacks and not spend on safety personnel is a grotesque decision.
We have a very balanced approach to capital allocation, combining capital expenditures at a fairly high level with dividends and buybacks as well. That's our commitment to our shareholders, to get the operating ratio down even lower. We pay a solid dividend we have for a long time, and we're using excess free cash flow to buy back our own shares.
But it is without morality. It has no morality to it other than maximize profits. And they're making those decisions within the rules. Now, within the rules, their lobbyists have helped shape. And those rules are these. We don't really have to upgrade our braking systems. We don't have to spend money on rail sensors. We're not being forced to do that. There is no two-person crew rule in effect right now, so we can understaff the trains. We are allowed to spend big money instead on stock buybacks. So all of those decisions are within the rules that they help shape, but that public officials who are accountable to us made. And so I think the public, the first and foremost people who should be called on the carpet by the public are, yes, the CEO of Norfolk Southern, but also the public's representatives. The public's representatives hold those jobs. Their job is to protect us. That is the job of Pete Buttigieg. That is the job of the Federal Railroad Administration. That is the job of the regulators. So when I hear people say, well, why are you blaming Pete Buttigieg? Why are you blaming the Department of Transportation and not Norfolk Southern? It's like, well, Pete Buttigieg is the cop that we hired to police this situation. And he did not revive the brake rule. He did not expand the definition of high hazard flammable trains. He did not put in place a sensor mandates and the like. Now, I think it's a good thing that the pressure he has belatedly responded to the pressure by saying, now promising to be for those things and do those things. That's the system working.
Right.
Like, that's what's supposed to happen.
Right. Well, look, I wonder what you make of that then, because there is this kind of complicit overlap between the would-be regulators and the industry, which has used its lobbying power to write the rules that the regulators are supposed to be independently coming to a decision about. What do you think is going to happen when the Norfolk Southern CEO faces the Senate, I think in the coming week?
Well, I think he's going to say this was unavoidable. I think he's going to say Congress shouldn't overreact. By the way, we're already seeing that from some of the rail industry's biggest allies, bankrolled allies on Capitol Hill. I mean, I saw for John Thune right here. John Thune is the senator from South Dakota, became the number 3 recipient of railroad industry campaign cash while he was pushing to repeal the brake rule. Ultimately succeeded when Donald Trump did that. But Senator John Thune is now out there saying, well, we got to wait to see what's recommended and what happened. And they're trying to slow the process. They don't want Congress to react. I think their expectation or what they're hoping for is that the attention goes away. Congress slow walks the legislative response. Ultimately, there is no legislative response. I mean, I think I saw that.
Well, what do you make of the John Fetterman and a bunch of others have put forward some legislation that includes, I believe, this new requirement for there to be heat sensors on the tracks more frequently and kind of as a train approaches a small town or a community that's adjacent to the tracks, like East Palestine. Do you think that kind of legislation is going to get slow rolled or won't be able to pass a divided Congress? Yeah.
I think the rail industry is hoping to slow roll it. I think their lobbying machine is going to work, and I think John Thune represents the sphere of their lobbying machine in the Senate. It just so happens that the chair of the House Transportation Committee, Missouri Congressman named Sam Graves, just so happens to be the number 1 recipient of rail industry campaign cash in the entire U.S. House. So my guess is they're going to hope that the sort of legislative process, the details of the legislative process, slow down any response. And if not slow it down, then water it down. I've said this before, I'll say it again. All you got to do is change a couple of shalls to mays, wills to cans in legislation, and you've turned a bill that requires things into a glorified press release. That's the lobbying machine going to work. And I'll harken back to what happened back in the Obama era, right? when we originally reported on the NTSB's recommendations being ignored, you could basically only find it in a footnote, right? You could find a footnote where, NTS is sort of an admission, some agencies came to us and said that, the rules should be broader, but we decided to make the rules this way. And if you read it, the first 10 passes of reading something like that, you're like, oh, that's not a big deal. Then you're like, wait a minute, they just limited the entire scope of all the rules to a much narrower scope. That's how the lobbying machine really, really works. And I think the expectation among the corporate lobbies is that the public can't follow that esoterica on a day-to-day, moment-to-moment basis, and that they can water things down to the point where the Congress will come out and say, hey, look, we passed rail safety legislation, but the thing has been...
it'll be toothless.
It'll be toothless.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I first just asked the question was, to the extent that the Norfolk Southern CEO is going to get grilled or could conceivably be grilled by a Senate panel that could be full of people who have been doing some of the bombastic posturing on the late night news shows, talking about how Democrats and Biden have abandoned East Palestine. Is it possible for the Senate to really go in the way that they should when the blame is so shared? The blame is so shared. And, if I were Norfolk Southern, I would absolutely be making the argument that they were that they were complicit in it as well. How much can we hope in terms of accountability to get from these hearings when it is this unholy marriage between industry and government that has led to this crisis?
Sure. But I weirdly have a little bit of hope in the sense that even notwithstanding all of this nonsense that we've been discussing, I think the system is weirdly working right now in a way that it's supposed to work, in this way. Yes, the Democrats' narrow attack trying to say that, oh, Donald Trump repealing the brake rule, that was the problem. Yes, that's not the full story. Yes, it's basically dishonest, decontextualized at least. Yes, the Republicans saying, aha, we have an opportunity to criticize Biden and Buttigieg, even though we were for the rail deregulation, we now have an opportunity to slam the Democrats and the current administration. The whole premise of the way a functioning democracy works is that yes, it's baked in that the factions are going to argue with each other. They're going to see opportunities to fight with each other. They're going to see opportunities to compete with each other to show who is more responsive to a crisis or more responsive to what voters want, in this case, rail safety. And that competition, regardless of the motives of the individual players, can actually produce things that are good for voters. In other words, the competition itself is the point, and the process can produce something good. Now, I think what rigs that process is the devil in the details, right? What we just talked about. Like, that's what the lobbyists are hoping for. But I think right now at the public level, where you've got the Republicans and Democrats competing to posture as we're taking this seriously, that's the kind of competition you want. Most of the time, you don't get that competition. Most of the time, you get something happens, a crisis happens, it lasts, one day in the news, and the political system doesn't even respond at all. So I think right now it's almost weird. We've been so inculcated to accept that usually when something bad happens, there's no response. We're actually seeing a response, and now I think the onus is on anybody who cares about this to, one, make sure that the details don't get watered down, and two, to keep the pressure on for the Congress to actually deliver something. And not just, by the way, the Congress, but for the Biden administration. Pete Buttigieg has a lot of rulemaking authority to do things here. And clearly, the pressure has been working. He's, for the first, 8 days, he didn't say anything about what happened. Then he came out and was like, well, I'm constrained. There's not much I can do. Finally, after enough pressure and shame, he went on national television and said, well, there's a lot we can do.
Well, a lot can be done. This is a moment when we can get more done than would have been thought possible before.
Here's an important point. That didn't happen because people went online defending Pete Buttigieg from critics and pressure like the reporting that we did. That happened because people were like, no, we know Pete Buttigieg is the top regulator of the railroad companies, and defending him is not going to be what gets him to act. That what got him to act, and I'm glad he's acting, what got him to act so far is that he has been shamed and pressured. Now, again, he's made a lot of promises. The pressure is going to need to be kept on for him to deliver on that.
I want to ask you about that, David. So what is it that Buttigieg has so far said he would do, and what do you think is left for him to take a responsibility for? What can he do that he hasn't yet said he would pursue?
He can begin, first and foremost, the rulemaking process to by rule, to expand the definition of what a high hazard flammable train is defined as in the rules. Now, I grant you that rulemaking can take a while, but he can at least start that process, initiate that process.
Well, what makes it such a time-consuming process?
You got to take public comment. You have to, writing the rules themselves takes some time. I'm not saying it takes forever. I'm saying there is a process, but the process needs to be initiated. He has power under existing law to begin that process. Now, I should add, Congress also has power to simply pass a bill that says, here's the definition of what a high hazard flammable train is, a much more honest definition. And Chris Deluzio, the freshman Democratic congressman from Western Pennsylvania, and Congressman Ro Khanna have a bill to do exactly this. So if Congress wants to speed things up, they can just pass the law saying, you know what, we're not waiting for the rulemaking process. We're going to do this right now. So Buttigieg can initiate that rule. The other thing Buttigieg can do on the brake stuff in particular is, he tried to say, well, I'm constrained by Congress. And there's a bunch of esoteric details about that. But the broad strokes are this. When Donald Trump repealed that, granted, narrowed brake rule, the one that was narrowed by the Obama administration's decision, but there was still a brake rule still affecting some trains. When Trump repealed that, he repealed it under a law that had been passed in, I think it was 2015, that allowed him to issue a cost-benefit analysis as a justification for repealing the brake rule. He gets into office. The rail industry says this is its priority. It doesn't want to spend money on these new brakes, even though it should be mentioned the rail industry had touted these new brakes years before as the way to prevent derailments. Trump goes and issues a cost-benefit analysis as justification for repealing the rule. Soon after, the cost-benefit analysis is exposed as a complete sham, like a factual sham. Enviro groups say, hey, listen, and the next administration can issue a new cost-benefit analysis based on how fraudulent this one is to begin the process of reinstating a brake rule and expanding it. Buttigieg could do that. Now, he insinuated that he didn't have any power to do much of anything after enough. And then a week later, he said, now we are going to be considering the hazmat definition and the brake rule. So my point is, evaluating. But I think the point is that even he's admitting now that he does have some power here as the regulator under current law. I mean, I've gotten a lot of feedback from liberals who want to defend Pete Buttigieg. Well, what can Pete Buttigieg do about a Republican-controlled House? It's like Pete Buttigieg has a lot of power under existing law to make rules. It's kind of interesting. I think a lot of people don't even realize this. And by the way, it extends to the airlines as well. Oh, well, what can Pete Buttigieg do? Pete Buttigieg is the sole regulator of the airlines. The attorneys general of states have been pressing him to put in place much tougher rules on airlines to prevent the kind of nonsense that we saw with the Southwest meltdown. This idea that Democrats get into office and then pretend to be powerless is it's annoying. And it's ridiculous. These people have a ton of power.
100%. I mean, I wanted to just drill down on, you mentioned that, I'm familiar with this bipartisan John Fetterman bill, which is co-sponsored by Sherrod Brown, J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, and Josh Hawley. But you mentioned this other bill that's supported by Ro Khanna and who else was it?
Chris Deluzio.
Chris Deluzio.
Yeah. freshman from Western Pennsylvania whose district kind of borders Pennsylvania, Ohio.
Okay.
Today, my colleague Mr. Khanna and I introduced the Derail Act, which ensures trains carrying hazardous materials are properly classified and have increased safety requirements. It's long overdue, but rail industry lobbyists have fought against it.
So one of my concerns with this John Fetterman bill, which is being touted and which I'm sure is a good idea, is that there does seem to be a lot of focus in particular on the heat sensors on the rails. And I've seen in a lot of the reporting, a lot of the coverage that's come out more recently about what actually caused this particular derailment is more focus is going on the heat sensors. And if that's the factual truth of what happened, I'm obviously not trying to undermine that. But my concern is that obviously there's a whole confluence of things that are going on. What caused the wheel to catch on fire? Would more inspections have prevented that faulty, functioning or whatever it was from happening in the first place? Once the train has caught on fire, is there, if it had the more advanced electronic braking system in place, would the train have stopped faster? Would it either have not derailed, or would the derailment have caused less damage to the tanks and there been less leakage that required the control burn? Could it have been controlled in a different way? If there, as you mentioned earlier, were better requirements for how kind of strong or thick or whatever it is the tanks had to be if they're carrying hazardous materials, again, would we have been in a situation where there was a derailment potentially, but not the same kind of environmental effect that we are now anticipating, right? So if the focus becomes, my concern is that if the focus becomes too much about just the heat sensors on the tracks, then that can be used to basically not have to pay attention to all these other things that are wrong with the industry, including some of these things like the staffing issues that implicate the entire precision railroading dynamic that, of course, was the underpinning of why there was so much labor discord at the end of last year when Joe Biden ultimately voted to break the rail strike.
I totally agree that allowing it to be boiled down to one thing misses the point. It is a regulatory environment in which this system is operating. So we have a derailment in East Palestine that will be determined to be about X, Y, and Z situation. But we have 1,000 derailments, more than 1,000 derailments a year. Another derailment will be about another piece of this regulatory environment.
And there was just a derailment in Ohio with the same rail carrier over the weekend.
Yes, exactly. So the point is, I agree with you that honing in only on one derailment, East Palestine or any other one, and one problem misses the forest through the trees. This is an entire regulatory environment. One other thing we didn't mention yet, which I should have mentioned at the top, the other thing is when these companies are making these safety decisions to spend more on buybacks than on staffing, they're also making it with the presumption baked in that if a derailment happens, they really will not be held financially accountable by the EPA and by other government agencies, that whatever cleanup, whatever amount that they're going to have to cough up is just a rounding error. In other words, they have a mathematical set of assumptions that, look, if we get to save a huge amount on not staffing our trains correctly, not investing in safety technology and the like, and we can use that money to enrich our executives and our shareholders through buybacks. And yeah, that increases the risk of a derailment. But if and when a derailment happens, we're only going to get a financial slap on the wrist. That's also part of it. So I think that when Buttigieg talks about increasing the fines that he is allowed to assess, that is actually a real issue that Congress needs to address. Similarly, when the EPA is involved, the EPA is the one that enforces who pays for a cleanup. The rail companies are presuming an EPA that will not force them to pay the bill for that. And we need an EPA that is serious about forcing them to pay that in a way that it actually financially causes some financial pain, so that the next time that the companies are thinking about making decisions, they say, hey, if something derails, that could actually derail our business model.
Yeah, I mean, so this is such a good point, because people have now been touting, the governor has been touting And Norfolk Southern has been touting the fact that they are set to pay, I think, $6.5 million to derailment victims, something along the ballpark of $7 million for the cleanup. And people are going on TV and saying Norfolk Southern's going to be forced to pay for the cleanup. They're going to be forced to pay for this, which, is a departure from the norm where per some media hits by Pete Buttigieg, there is a $225,000 cap on what these railroad companies are, like a statutory cap on what they have to pay, which of course is absurd and that should be raised. But on the other hand, even though 6.5 million is a lot more than 225,000, in the scope of Norfolk Southern's profits for 1 year, not just how much they earn, but the net profits for 1 year, I think someone we talked about it this morning on Rising. It's like 1%, basically. It is a rounding error, as you say. Not to mention the fact that cleaning up the immediate catastrophe doesn't say anything about what the long-term costs are going to be down the line from potential medical fallout. What we've seen from some of these toxic torts is that one family might get $4 million, which is probably not even enough, really, but might end up getting a $4 million payout from an accident like this. Not to mention a whole town of nearly 5,000 people who knows what their medical costs are ultimately going to be down the line. So it does also feel like there's some preemptive getting ahead of it that's being done by the rail company that says, okay, we're going to pay way more than we might otherwise have to pay. We're going to not fight this at this juncture in a way that might be insulating themselves against an actual accounting of what they're likely going to owe down the line and to paint themselves as, frankly, that not that bad a guy in this instance.
Absolutely. I mean, the presumption is that they'll put up a showy amount of money now and that the long-term costs will effectively be socialized. The long-term healthcare costs, environmental cleanup costs over decades, the costs for victims, et cetera, will be borne by the public or simply not borne in the sense of people will just get sick and die. Right. That's
and go bankrupt their entire families that so many people do when there's a cancer diagnosis.
Exactly. I think that's their presumption. And I think the way to change corporate behavior or part of the way to change corporate behavior moving forward is to make clear that will not happen, that those assumptions are wrong, that there are real punishments that come with corporate decisions, real financial punishments, consequences that come with making those corporate decisions. We don't live in a country where those consequences are obvious or enforced most of the time. But perhaps, I mean, I'm not being overly optimistic here, but perhaps this is an inflection point, right? I mean, I did see the EPA come out and say, listen, we're really serious about making sure that Norfolk Southern is the one that pays these costs. Now, do I have confidence that kind of enforcement attitude will preserve and prevail? I don't have confidence in that, other than to say that if pressure needs to be kept on for those kinds of things.
Yeah, I mean, this is delicate. I don't know quite how to say this, but sometimes I feel like, but for Fox News deciding to make East Palestine its pet project to embarrass the Biden administration, very little of the kind of positive movement from the Biden administration, Pete Buttigieg, et cetera, would have happened.
Listen. In a sense, I agree. And I'll go back to the point that I made about amorality. It is not to laud Fox News for, applaud them for their honest, principled and honestly motivated criticism of the Biden administration. It is to say that the political dynamic aligned as such as to where the Fox News sheer hypocritical opportunism and the Republican Party writ large, it's hypocrisy. Oh, now it's suddenly for safety regulation, it's ridiculous. But that these forces kind of accidentally aligned in a way that is creating some momentum, right? Like the Democrats want to blame Trump only. Fox News wants to blame Biden only. And Republicans want to blame Biden only. And this has created a competition for both parties to try to shame each other into showing and to compete to show who is taking this situation more seriously. And I agree with you, but for that dynamic, I'm not sure we would see a bipartisan rail safety bill. I'm not sure we would see, the EPA or Pete Buttigieg taking this all that seriously, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, which begs the question, what do you make of, one, the time it took for Pete Buttigieg to finally get to East Palestine, and two, the choice by Joe Biden not to visit at all? Now, he has said more recently that he plans to visit, but no date has been set. Obviously, Donald Trump visited, probably a couple of weeks ago now, to great fanfare with Trump branded products and a deep knowledge of the McDonald's menu, which was very impressive to all involved. Why not go, given the political stakes of the thing?
Because I think he presumed it would be a 1 or 2 day story. I think, and in some ways, I think that wasn't an uninformed assumption, because unfortunately, that's how most things in America, we live in an accountability-free world where disasters are happening all the time and no one ever gets called on the carpet.
I think that's why he didn't visit on February 10th, right?
Right.
But by the time he was visiting Ukraine for the anniversary of Russia's invasion, right? That was when the big headline in the kind of conservative media world was Biden's in Ukraine, but doesn't have time to go to East Palestine. And that was at the end of February, after an accident that happened on February 3rd. So at some time in those intervening 3 weeks, it became obvious that it wasn't a one-day story. And even after getting back from Europe, and even after Trump's visit, there's still nothing.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's really a good question. I mean, part of me wonders if, at first he was like, oh, this won't be a big deal. It'll just sort of go away like everything else goes away. And then now if I show up, I'll look like I was pressured into it, and sort of hopefully it'll go away before I feel pressured into it. Then Trump goes and it's like, oh, wow, now it's ridiculous. Now I really have to go. So I think there was a kind of a crescendoing or snowballing set of decisions to not go and just hope it goes away, to the point where by the time he went, it was like, wow, now you're showing up, you look kind of ridiculous, showing he looked kind of silly. And then the argument they put out there, which was actually embarrassing, was like, well, no transportation secretary has ever gone to the site of a derailment. Oh, and then the funniest one I found was, well, he did a bunch of television sort of media interviews for the first, 72 hours after the derailment, and none of the media asked him about it. It's like, well, that's an indictment of the media. You need CNN hosts and MSNBC hosts to ask you questions to know that something's important. What is that about?
Yeah, it felt almost as though, I don't know, perhaps the quick politicization of the accident by Fox News put Democrats in the defensive. It's almost like that Trump derangement thing, where it's like, if a conservative says it's important, then I have to act like I don't care about it, or else I'm doing a bad.
Yeah.
Because the Fox News ecosystem came out so strongly in support of East Palestine, it almost felt like the Democrats did a stutter step trying to figure out if they were also allowed to care about human beings in the middle of a rail disaster, because it happened to be a Trump country, and conservatives were rallying behind this cause. Such
a good point, that it is a kind of telling moment where, in the immediate aftermath of the disaster, there wasn't simply a principled impulse of, hey, we need to take this really seriously, both on the ground in terms of, and I think there is evidence that the sort of agencies took it seriously, but that we need to take this seriously as a sort of public-facing administration priority. That decision motivated by principle, hey, something bad just happened that we need to have a public-facing, real, robust response. That wasn't motivated on principle. It was kind of belatedly motivated out of like, well, the other party sees an opportunity. It was like so political, right? It was like so, it was in that sense, it was kind of hollow.
Yes. Yes. And I think you can still feel that. You can feel that one. I mean, Pete Buttigieg isn't the world's most charismatic person, although a lot of Democrats think he is. I don't know. But, you know, his kind of stiffness on the ground in East Palestine, I think, is somewhat just Pete Buttigieg being Buttigieg. It's the same Buttigieg where on the campaign trail, he visited a picket line and was like, well, how much do you guys have in your strike funds? You know, like that version of Pete Buttigieg. But also some of it I do think is that, like, Republicans just captured the narrative in a way that left Democrats not knowing what to do. Now, there's obviously a path for Democrats. Democrats should be saying loudly and repeatedly, I don't care if it's Trump country or not. I'm the president of all Americans. I'm the transportation secretary of all Americans. And this is a disaster that should not have happened and did happen because of the negligence of multiple administrations. Now, no one in the Biden administration is ever going to say a bad word about the Obama administration, but boy, oh boy, what credibility they would have if they did. Moreover, one of my real concerns here is that we're going to have a bipartisan commitment to bills that don't actually get to the root of the problem, because the political sniping of the whole thing is going to serve as kind of a cover for some of the fundamental underlying interests. And I don't want to be overly pessimistic, but I mean, what do you do? I mean, the Democrats can't find solid footing when the Republicans are having to defend regulations. I mean, like, look at this posture of what the arguments that are happening on Fox News right now. Republicans are suddenly like, why aren't there more regulations? Gosh darn.
I know. I know.
We're living in the is rolling in his grave. Right, exactly.
I know. I know.
And at the same time, they're saying you can't trust the EPA. The EPA is telling you the water in your home is fine, but this government organization is lying to you. Now, I understand the skepticism about some of this early testing and assurances that have come from both local government and the EPA. Now, it's fairly limited. It's the EPA saying we tested for this chemical. We're not seeing it in this tap water. We're going to keep testing. So I think that some of the criticism of the EPA kind of giving the premature thumbs up is premature. I think, you have to continue testing and we'll see what happens. But there's a sloppiness to the conservative messaging that is only, like we're pro regulation, but not this regulatory agency, that exists because Democrats are figuring out how to grab the reins here. And they aren't using this opportunity, which is a huge one, to prove the value of the regulatory state, to prove exactly why tort reform in the 90s was such a terrible idea, because it allowed these kind of companies to externalize their costs all over the place and convince the American public that it's a good thing when you can't sue a corporation. It's a good thing that the McDonald's lady had her judgment reduced because she was just a bad actor, And instead of capitalizing on these opportunities, we're getting Pete Buttigieg shuffling around and Joe Biden saying, I'll go at some point.
I completely agree. And I do think you're right. We are living in the upside down world. I also think what's going to be equally as interesting is, how does the Republican Party square, like, ultimately it's going to have to square its, hey, we need more safety regulations with the fact that it's been the deregulatory party, right? Like, at some point, J.D. Vance, as an example, or Marco Rubio, who are championing a rail safety bill, if it gets gutted, now, again, there's a big if here, if they are asked questions, it's like, your party has been against regulation. Your party is working to try to gut your own bill. What do you have to say about that? Right? Like, what there is this schism in the Republican Party in which they're gonna presumably have to decide which side of, like, regulate or not regulate they're on. And you've already seen this break out into the open. You saw there was a Politico story, I think it was last week, where it says, some Republicans are now already starting to push back on the idea of more safety regulations for the rail system. So that party, too, is going to need to kind of figure it out. Although my guess is they're hoping, maybe they're relying on the fact that the Democrats won't get their act together to actually force the issue. Now, as we're talking today, I think it was like an hour or two ago, Chuck Schumer gave a speech on the floor of the Senate demanding passage of, granted, what he calls a real serious rail safety bill.
I've written a letter to every major rail company demanding they outline exactly what steps they're taking to prevent what happened in Ohio from happening here in Elmira.
Senator Schumer also formally announced his support for the new bipartisan Railway Safety Act. The senator says the bill would make common sense safety reforms, help increase communication with first responders, and make railroad companies pay for their wrongdoing.
So I do think that with this bipartisan bill, the Democrats belatedly see an opportunity to exploit the division in the Republican Party and to look like the Democrats are doing something to actually pass a rail safety bill that the public presumably broadly supports. I mean, broadly supporting the idea of like making the rails safer. And I think the Democrats see an opportunity here. And again, I go back to the idea that this is the process working. This is the dynamic that we should want on every issue, where the Republicans see an opportunity to criticize Democrats, where the Democrats deserve to be criticized, even if the Republicans' motive is not a good, it's just a purely amoral, opportunistic motive. And the Democrats have to respond by actually doing something.
Yeah.
That's the dynamic we want on every issue.
I mean, it reminds me, frankly, David, of the scenario that happened at the State of the Union, where Joe Biden accuses some Republicans of trying to cut Social Security. Republicans boo and deny it from the crowd. And he says, oh, okay, well, if we're in a competition to say who wants to protect Social Security more, great. I guess we've all agreed to cut Social Security.
Some Republicans want Medicare and Social Security to sunset. I'm not saying it's a majority. Let me give you, anybody who doubts it, contact my office. I'll give you a copy. I'll give you a copy of the proposal. That means Congress doesn't vote. Well, I'm glad to see you. And I tell you, I enjoy conversion.
I bring that up with you in particular, David, because I know that you have been tracking probably more closely than anyone in the United States of America, Joe Biden's own flip-flopping on the issue of Social Security. And of course, this was a significant issue during the Bernie campaign. And I think the subject of the only negative ad Bernie has ever done in his career.
Let me ask you a question, Joe.
Yeah.
You're right here with me.
Yeah.
Have you been on the floor of the Senate? You were in the Senate for a few years.
Yeah.
Time and time again, talking about the necessity, with pride, about cutting Social Security, cutting Medicare, cutting veterans programs.
No.
You never said that.
No.
When I argued that we should freeze federal spending, I meant Social Security as well. I meant Medicare and Medicaid. I meant veterans benefits. I meant every single solitary thing in the government.
Look, here's the deal.
You're an honest guy. Why don't you just tell the truth here? We all make mistakes.
I am telling the truth.
And I not only tried it once, I tried it twice, I tried it a third time, and I tried it a fourth time.
Joe, let me repeat it again. I want you just to be straight with the American people. I am saying that you have been on the floor of the Senate time and time again talking about the need to cut Social Security, Medicare, and veterans programs. Is that true or is that not true?
No, it's not true.
That is not true?
That is not true.
I meant veterans benefits. I meant every single solitary thing in the government.
Everything was on the table. I did not support any of those cuts in Social Security or in veterans benefits.
Whoa. Everything was on the table. All right, you're right. You just said it, including, in your judgment, cuts to Social Security and veterans.
In order to get the kinds of changes we need on other things related.
Joe, then
but we did not cut it.
I know, because people like me helped stop that. All that I would say to the American people, go to YouTube. It's all over the place. Joe said it many, many times. And I'm surprised, you can defend that or change your mind on it, but you can't deny the reality.
So I wonder what you made about, like, what kind of emotions were you feeling in that moment as you watched Biden rally this kind of good defense of Social Security, but a somewhat hypocritical one?
I kind of marveled at the fact that the new Joe Biden has completely discarded and pretends never existed the old Joe Biden, the old Joe Biden who was for freezing and or cutting Social Security. Like, it's just gone. I mean, it's like erased. It's like not even an attempt to pretend that person even existed. It's like or to acknowledge that person existed. It's a desire to pretend that person never even happened. Like, at one point I was like, wait a minute, maybe maybe Joe Biden, maybe that old Joe Biden didn't exist. It's just like a figment of my, like, I'm being gaslit here. Like, I know that old Joe Biden. I like went back and looked at I was like, yeah, that is the same Joe Biden. But like, so there was like like marveling at that, but there was also like, okay, so like setting aside the fact that he's just pretending his old self didn't exist. Like, that's good. But one thing you could say about Joe Biden, he has a kind of innate sense of where the center of his own party is. He positions himself a little bit to the right of the center of his party. By the way, that can explain why he was for Social Security cuts back in the early and mid 90s, the center of his party. There was a much more robust austerity movement inside of his party at that time. So it's the same thing now. Joe Biden recognizes the center of his party's moved. He's moved with that center. He sees the political opportunity there, and he's seizing it. And that's, in a certain sense, that's a good politician. I mean, it's not a particularly honest politician.
Right. It's amoral.
There's no morality to it. There's no honesty, but it's like, okay, like, and actually what it says, the positive thing that comes out of it is the people who did the work of moving the center of the party, that's a reflection of their success, right? Like Joe Biden hammering the Republicans for potentially trying to cut Social Security and pretending the old Joe Biden doesn't exist, that is a reflection of the fact of all of the work that was done to move the center of the Democratic Party from a center that accepted the idea of so-called entitlement reforms, aka Social Security cuts, to a center of the party that says, no, that's not acceptable. So I saw that. Ultimately, I was like, not only is that a good move by Joe Biden, it doesn't take a rocket science to figure out that it's a good move, but that is actually a watershed moment, recognizing the progress that millions and millions of people have made in successfully pressuring the Democratic Party.
And I got to say, chief among them, David Sirota, is you. I know that you were driving that push. It was like pulling teeth at times to get that kind of a direct hit during the Bernie campaign. But it's you and your research and your doggedness that finally got us to the place where we at least got that one ad out.
Yes, and then the funniest part was like Joe Biden. I remember the Biden campaign was like indignant. They're like, hey, Joe Biden would never cut Social Security. Like the point is that at that point they were pretending the old Joe Biden didn't exist and actually pretending to be angry that anybody thought the old Joe Biden existed. To the point where they were making commitments, forward-looking commitments, to never be the old Joe Biden, which, granted, like I would have liked to have won the campaign, not have defeat Joe Biden in the primary. But if there's one like if there's a victory in defeat, it's that pinning him down on that, making him position himself that way. That is a victory that we're seeing the fruits of now. Now, I'm not saying that Joe Biden won't go back if the politics change and try to strike a grand bargain. It's going to require sort of continued vigilance. But pinning him down and getting him to sort of create his political formula on a different set of calculations than, I'm the centrist who wants to cut Social Security, that's a victory now. And that when he's bashing the Republicans for that, that's the fruits of those victories.
Yeah, well, it won't surprise you to learn that Glenn Kessler did a fact check on Bernie's claims back in 2020 that was not especially favorable to Bernie Sanders.
I mean, honestly, the craziest part of that, we're just talking about that. It's one thing for Biden to have the campaign to have been like Biden campaign to be like, oh, he never really pushed Social Security. It's just flagrant. I mean, literally, it's on video. He's giving a Senate floor speech bragging about it.
And I not only tried it once, I tried it twice, I tried it a third time, and I tried it a fourth time.
But I remember the fact checking, the cottage industry of fact checkers in DC. So, well, Sanders said this and that, and it wasn't a full cut. It was only a freeze. Like they They fact checked a fact. Like the fact checking process took a verifiable fact and put it into dispute. In other words, it was like Orwellian. Like the fact-checking industry is supposed to like nail down the facts. The fact-checking industry took a fact on video, on a C-SPAN video, and turned it into, well, maybe it's this or maybe it's not. Who can tell?
Yes.
Who among us can tell?
This is what Kessler said. He said the bottom line, Sanders framed this as 40 years of working with Republicans to cut Social Security. But these statements came during periods when a growing budget deficit was a major concern in official Washington. Biden, like many mainstream politicians, thought action needed to be taken. So basically, everyone else was trying to cut Social Security. So it means that Biden wasn't trying to cut Social Security?
Actually, now you're reminding me. It's not just that. It's that, actually, yes, he was trying to cut Social Security, but here's some context for why. Like, even if you stipulate that the context is, okay, maybe let's just stipulate that nonsense context is fully correct. You're still not disputing the fact that he was trying to cut Social Security. Like, that's the point.
Oh, good times. I always appreciate a walk down memory lane with you, David. I also really do I got to say again how much I appreciate your coverage at The Lever, generally speaking, but specifically in the context of this East Palestine stuff. It's been really remarkable. I have that first long article printed out, and I reference it repeatedly because it remains, I think, the best aggregation of all of the facts and dynamics and, lobbying efforts and senators who took the donations. All of that is so well laid out in that piece. And I want to thank you so much for all of the hard journalism that you've been doing for so many years.
Thank you. And thanks for having me.
All right. It's been a pleasure. If you want to continue this conversation, I will see you later tonight on Call-In. And if you want more Bad Faith content, you can subscribe at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast and get a free Monday, a premium episode every Monday. And as always, take care of yourselves and keep the faith. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.